Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harinkyu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Wednesday, July the 20th, and today I am joined by Alabama House Minority Leader Representative Anthony Daniels. Now, you might have seen our coverage yesterday that Representative Daniels did release a letter that he sent to Governor Kay Ivey asking for a special legislative session to talk about maybe some amendments to the 2019 Alabama Human Life Protection Act. Now, if you need a little bit of a refresh, that law from 2019 was passed before the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade last month. Now that law is in effect. It is essentially the law of the land here in Alabama, and it essentially bans abortions in most every case except for one very small exception of life of the mother and a serious health risk to the mother. Now, Representative Daniels, I know that's a really glossy overview about what exactly this law is and what this topic is, but I'd love to hear from you a little bit about why you thought it was important to ask the governor for this special session and exactly what you would do if you did get the special session.
Well, for me, I would tell you that it is very disturbing to see how the Alabama law impacts women in the state of Alabama and their health. This particular law has no exception for rape and incest. I introduced an amendment back in 2019 to try to protect and provide an exception for rape and incest. It was voted down. There are also not a lot of clarity in the language in the bill for healthcare professionals. We talk about the health of the mother being at risk as one of the only exceptions in this particular law. But you've seen cases around the country where physicians are afraid to see women that have miscarriages. I read an article relative to a woman having a miscarriage that was told to go back home until she's started hemorrhaging or a blood clot per se to that point, not necessarily that action, but to that point to where it appears to be a risk, a health risk, and then they would see them and treat them. And so we've seen these cases around the country. We've seen where a 10-year-old in Ohio was raped and had to go to Indiana to have an abortion. And it's just for me it's really disturbing that we have a law that's a total ban on abortion with no exceptions for rape and incest, and so that should not just bother me, but also bother all of our citizens within the state of Alabama and beyond.
When the Supreme Court ruled in that Dobbs decision last month to overturn Roe versus Wade in the constitutional right to an abortion, there was a law from Alabama from the 1950s that was kind of the default law that went into effect before the courts were able to take off the hold on the 2019 Alabama Human Life Protection Act. So again, we kind of reverted to that 1950s law before the newer 2019 law was allowed to take effect and go on the books. But what I think is interesting is the former law, the 1950s law that was in effect in Alabama before Roe versus Wade allowed for protections in 1973. That law was actually less strict than today's law, that 2019 law. So if just to refresh memories, that 1950s law actually made it a misdemeanor for a woman to receive an abortion. Now, the 2019 law makes it a felony for the doctor who performs that procedure, which is punishable. I'm looking at the numbers in front of me just so I get it right, punishable by 10 to 99 years in prison for a doctor. So that law from pre-Roe was a misdemeanor. The law today is a felony. How does that sit with you?
Well, it doesn't sit well. It doesn't sit well with the constituents that I represent here in the Huntsville area. It doesn't sit well for women all across the state of Alabama. That's why you see a number of protests, a number of rallies around the state of Alabama, a lot of commentary online and in person among women throughout Alabama, and among fathers and grandfathers that have children, right, and that have a spouse, that have female family members. It's your neighbor, it's your friend, it's someone that lives down the street from you, and so we got to I can't put myself in a woman's shoes. I can't do that. But what I can do is I can understand and try to understand what I can't understand about the situation. Which, when you hear all the stories where lives are being at risk, and what are we doing to reduce the maternal mortality rate? What are we doing to reduce the infant mortality rate? We have to make certain that we care more about life than we are demonstrating. And so for me, it's sickening. It's sickening to me for any person that's raped or incest to have to carry a baby to term. We got to think about the psychological aspect, the mental health aspect of that, and then the risk for the medical risk is it's not explained very well, because there are physicians that are afraid to see women that have had miscarriages. And so I think that there needs to be a lot more clarity. There needs to be an exception for rape and incest inside of the bill, and we got to focus more on the law in a broader context, and we got to work with physicians and researchers that have been studying this for years.
Let's talk a little bit about that clarity you said that is needed. Now, again, in that 2019 law, the one that is in effect today, there is the only exception for abortions is to protect a woman from, quote, a serious health risk. Now, there is not really a definition of a serious health risk. So your definition of serious health risk, mine, my friends, your friends, are going to vary, just because, again, there's not a black and white situation for what we call serious. That's a pretty subjective word there. Tell me a little bit about that. Do you think there needs to be a very clear definition there? Or do you think that this line, the serious health risk, means that it's up to doctors to determine?
Well, there's no clarity in it. And I think that for physicians that have been practicing for some time and seeing some of the threat of prosecution in other states, I think that that's something that, because it's not clear and it's vague to them, I think that's something that they're going to try to avoid as much as possible. But you have some that are really willing to risk it all. If they feel that the life is in danger, and they're taking a risk. But you have some that won't. And so for me, if we are going to make certain that we give families the freedom to make the choice or a private decision that should be between them and their doctors, and that we're expanding the size of government and government intrusion into our households and our bedrooms, what's next? And so I think that this is a dangerous piece of legislation that's going down the road will have far greater consequences than it has benefits for the people of Alabama. There are people that consider themselves to be pro-life, but that believes that rape and incest, not having an exception for rape and incest, is just horrible. And so, what do we say to those individuals?
We talk a little bit about, again, the stance, the pro-life stance of many of Alabama's politicians, for the anti-abortion stance as well, as we should say. And this act is called the Alabama Human Life Protection Act. But you mentioned in your letter to the governor some statistics, including one that Alabama is, I believe, the third highest rate of maternal mortality in the nation. We also have a very high infant mortality rate. So how do you reckon that those numbers of the maternal mortality, infant mortality, along with a law that is supposedly protecting human life?
Well, for me, when I look at it, we've been advocating, and our caucus have been advocating for more expanding access to healthcare. In fact, the previous legislative session, we fought really hard to try to get women that are on Medicaid, for example, their healthcare after having a child was only 90 days, and their healthcare expired. We were able to get funding secured for approximately 5 years, 3 to 5 years, for those individuals to be able to have access to healthcare for up to a year. That's still not enough, but to say that we are pro-life and we're protecting life, let's protect all lives. Let's take care of the children once they're born. Let's take care of families once they're born. Having one of the third highest maternal mortality rate in the United States of America stems from individuals not having access to the appropriate health care, or not necessarily having the infrastructure in many of our communities across the state, particularly our rural community, which I'm from a rural community across the state of Alabama. There are more than 38 states in the state of Alabama that do not have an OBGYN or OB. How do we take care of prenatal care? How do we take care of mothers and families when we've not necessarily done our due diligence to build the infrastructure to care and treat these individuals?
I want to throw a couple of numbers and a couple of statistics at you. You already mentioned one about how 50% of Alabama's hospitals do not have obstetrical services there. And again, many counties do not have access to I believe that was my stat, excuse me, 50% of counties do not have access to obstetrical services there, and especially in the Black Belt in rural Alabama. You mentioned that. Also, again, we spoke a couple of weeks ago, me and one of my colleagues, about Alabama's sex education program and about how Alabama has one of the highest teen pregnancy rates in the nation. And looking at some of that data of who received abortions, some of the latest data from the Alabama Department of Public Health shows that a child as young as 11 received an abortion here in the state and included in that data. An 11-year-old, what is your thinking about an 11-year-old receiving an abortion, especially if you reckon that with today's law? This was before that 2019 law was able to be enacted. But in today's law, there could be a chance that that child would not fall under the clause of serious health risk and would be forced to carry that pregnancy to term.
Well, actually, yes, we've seen that in Ohio, where that 10-year-old that was raped had to go to Indiana to have an abortion. That's no different than the state of Alabama. If a person is raped or incest, or a teenager or a young child is pregnant, they will have to carry that child to term, unless there's a extreme evidence that poses that there is a medical risk to the mother. And so I think that those are things that when you pass legislation, you're being reactive to an isolated incident, but you're not thinking through the broader aspect of it. You don't think through some of the things that may not be deemed as a medical emergency they may have been an oversight. You got to think about the fear from the physicians and really seeing how whether or not this mother is at risk or what have you. And so and then there's some things that happen at the spur of the moment that you can't judge, that doesn't meet the eye. And then you got to look at access to healthcare. Individuals that want to have an abortion right now, communities, especially underrepresented communities, they don't have the resources to go to a state that may perform an abortion. And so, we've created laws that impact not just underrepresented communities, but communities all across the state of Alabama. And this is something that we have to give a second look to.
There's a statistic from 1969 from some reporting that we did in 2019 when that law was signed by Governor Ivey that said illegal abortions accounted for 50% of maternal deaths in Jefferson County in the year of 1969. That's half of maternal deaths in Jefferson County at the time, the biggest county housing the biggest city at the time in Alabama. Half of those deaths were from illegal abortions. Do you worry that could be a statistic that repeats itself today?
I am concerned about the overall issue and how it impacts us long term, how it is going to exacerbate the actual maternal mortality rate. Yes, absolutely. I think it will significantly increase the maternal mortality rate. I think that you are already beginning to see some physicians talking about leaving the state of Alabama, especially those that are in critical areas that we need, OBGYN and others. That are focuses on women's health, that are having discussions about leaving the state of Alabama, where we already have a shortage of physicians in OB and OBGYNs. And so I think we're creating a much larger problem, and we've not provided any real solutions to solving the problem even before now. Being pro-life is one thing, but not necessarily having the infrastructure to reduce unwanted pregnancies, be more preventative about it. We've not done. There's no evidences of us focusing on that. Health access to quality healthcare, and then we're leaving the interpretation up to a physician to interpret law, right? And so right now there's no real definition as to what's permissible and what's not. And so that for me, it's dangerous. It's going to have a long-term effect. And next, we're just going too far with government's intervention of a person's household.
You mentioned something earlier that I think it's worth circling back to, and that is the case of miscarriages. I actually read recently about a woman in Georgia, just over the line here from Alabama, who had a miscarriage at 7 weeks and could not find a physician to perform a procedure on her to remove that fetus. And again, that's a procedure that is very similar to the abortion procedure. These doctors were afraid that they would be prosecuted, afraid they would be sent to prison for performing that procedure. And it took her weeks to find a doctor that would be able to do that. Do you worry that we will hear those type of stories happening in Alabama?
Absolutely, and there may be stories in Alabama that have things that have happened that we may not have been privy to up until this point, or folks are not willing to share out of fear, because we do have prosecutors that are looking at these situations throughout the state of Alabama because of the state law, and so I think that it's dangerous. I've read a story about someone actually having a miscarriage and having to carry that fetus for 2 weeks. And so imagine the psychological aspect and the health risk of that particular mother long term for because of the delayed time. And so you're seeing stories and reading stories time after time. But one of the things I need to make certain that is very clear: it's not the physician's fault; it is the lawmaker's fault. And so let's make certain that we understand that the physicians are only trying to protect themselves and protect their license and their craft and what they enjoy doing. We should not put them in a tough position to where they're having to regret decisions that were made that ended up in a fatality.
What would you urge women to do who are in that situation and maybe who can't find a physician to help her, or maybe is afraid of reaching out to a physician because of the threat, again, of going to prison? We know that this law does not qualify women who are seeking those procedures as those who are punishable with that felony. It does with doctors. But sometimes you see that people are just scared to even get in that situation in the first place. So what do you advise them to do?
Well, I personally think that they should talk to their physician. Physicians have these physician networks to really kind of give advice and guidance on these particular situations. But I would ask them to reach out to the lawmakers, those individuals that may be faced with this situation, but those before anyone is faced with that situation, to start reaching out to your lawmakers and urging them to repeal this 2019 law that punishes physicians, as well as forces individuals that are victims of victims of rape and incest to be able to carry a child to term.
We know that, again, the communications director for the governor did tell our reporter from AL.com yesterday that the governor would not be calling for a special session, and that the governor did want that 2019 law enacted, and that was why she signed it. I understand that you have not heard back from the governor yet. Do you expect to hear back from the governor, and what would be your response to that?
Well, my response is that I'm extremely concerned and really disappointed that the governor would respond to a law that does not provide exceptions for rape and incest. What do you say to those individuals that are victims of rape and incest? What do you say to children that have to go through this situation? And so my question to the governor is, that response is that's not showing leadership. And that response, in my mind, shows no empathy for the situation. And I would think that, for being a female, I think that's something that you would certainly think through and think about, and how we address this issue, and doing things to really help mitigate some of the arising issues that may happen long term. And so, very disappointed with the response, and because the 2019 law is one of the most restrictive abortion bans in the United States of America. Any abortion bill that does not take into account or does not provide clarity on the health and the medical condition of the mother and is not explained, that's a fault in the law. The other piece is not having rape and incest being protected within this law. That's another flaw. And then the mere fact that we've not necessarily funded research for maternal mortality at the highest rate that we can possibly do it. I think it may have been $500,000, maybe up to $1 million on the research side, especially for women of color. We should have been doubling down on these efforts before even bringing any piece of legislation. You don't bring a piece of legislation to outlaw or ban something without understanding all of the situations, right? I can't walk in these women's shoes, right? And so for me and for us as a state, we got to think about that. We got to think about the process, and we got to think about the impact that this have over women and children long term.
The next regular session is not until March of 2023. If there is not a special session called for this issue, what do you plan to do?
Well, we're going to keep pushing. We think that the people of Alabama will have the last word, final word on this issue. Let me be also clear. I don't think that there's anyone standing around that supports abortion as a birth control. So let me make that very clear. So I'm not here advocating for abortion and using it as a birth control. What I'm advocating for today is the health and wellness of the women and the people of our state. I'm advocating for us to do something quickly before this situation exacerbates to even further and put women at risk. And so for me, I think that all of the women of Alabama and the men and those individuals that support that have wives and family members, males should be involved in this movement as well. Sending letters to the governor, talking to your representatives about repealing this piece of legislation.
House Minority Leader Representative Anthony Daniels, thank you today for this conversation. This is, I think, sheds a light on an issue that so many people are talking about right now at their kitchen tables and in their homes, and really brings it, again, back into the public. So thank you again, Representative Daniels. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everybody watching, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.